Try not to say, is this thing on? I need like a live catchphrase, like bada bing, bada boom. So I'm gonna have on Brian Karr from Mold Finders. And I know a lot of you have had questions about mold and how it relates to our health and our living environments. And I don't have the answers for you, but Brian does. I'm learning a lot. Brian on here. Hi guys. I did it. I gotta lower my chair.
I know, I had to fix my whole setup. I spent like 5 minutes getting it set up. I think we're good.
Yeah. Hey, Brian.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited. I'm excited to do
I am
it.
too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just try and intro you a little bit, but then I want you to kind of tell us who you are and what you're about.
Yeah,
So this is Brian Karr. He is host of Mold Finders Radio. It's a podcast that is so helpful. I'm going to mention it again at the end because there were, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of questions for you, and some of them were along the same thread. But if we don't answer your question today, or if it's not as in depth as you would like, please check out his podcast. It answers so much. And Brian is an absolute mold expert. He's referred to by pretty much any doctor around that is literate in mold and what it can do to your health. So I'm so excited to get to have you on today and answer some of these really important and interesting questions. Is there anything else you want to share about who you are and what you do?
Um, yeah. Hey guys, I'm Brian. Yeah, I mean, basically what we do, like big picture, it's been years. I won't go in the whole story. If you really want to hear the whole story, episode 1 of the podcast is like my entire origin story. So it's all there for you guys. But basically, I had a mold situation myself when I didn't know anything years and years and years ago. And I was lucky enough that my future father-in-law helped me figure it out, who was ultimately my mentor that taught me, all of these things. And so I kind of took all that, and then we've created this platform where we share all of that with people. But at the end of the day, our focus is really working on with people that are mold sensitive, hypersensitive in some way, where environment's really impacting their health, and understanding that like general industry guidelines and kind of what's accepted is not really the best way to do things. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that. It's just we're so behind the curve of accepting it that so my whole thing is like, why do we want to wait 30 or 40 years for that to happen? Or let's start sharing that now, and people that want to kind of take that and run with it and kind of bypass that waiting process for the government to catch up or whatever, I'll help you do that. And so that's kind of what we do. And so we go in, we find where mold is hiding, we figure out how it's traveling through a house, we understand how it's impacting all the different areas, figure out testing, where's the source, how's it moving, what types of toxins are present, and we ultimately create remediation plans to kind of get homes back to an environment that really can help people heal the way that they want to be healing. And so that's the quick elevator pitch.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I like that you brought up too, there are some people that are more sensitive to mold and these mycotoxins than others. Can you, for those of us that don't really know what a mycotoxin is, can you kind of share a little bit on that?
Yeah, so a mycotoxin, it's actually a chemical. It's not even a living thing. And so a lot of us, we hear the phrase toxic mold, and so we think that like the mold is the toxic part of it. And toxic is such an interesting word if you just use that in its own phrase, because like, what does that mean for certain people? I think, it could be different. There could be things that are toxic to you that are not like, quote, toxins, you know what I mean? And so it gets tough, like when you really try to identify definitions. But basically the way that, let me see if I can do this in the camera. The way that a mycotoxin works, this is your mold colony, okay? So the mold is sitting here doing its thing. If another mold or bacteria or something else, it doesn't even have to be environment, something else comes to kind of like infringe on its territory, tick it off, irritate it, it creates this chemical, which is the mycotoxin, covers it kind of like lava over a volcano, and it kind of creates like a toxic moat. And then whatever's coming over, it's meant to kill that living thing. So it's basically a toxin that's meant to kill living things. And that's what a mycotoxin is. Now, we're obviously much larger than this kind of microbiological warfare that's going on. So it doesn't like kill us like it would other things, but it could just wreak havoc on our system and create long-term effects. And so that's kind of like the brief little of what a mycotoxin is. But the big thing on mycotoxin and kind of understanding is that you have two separate things. Mold is your organism. Mold is the factory that's creating it. Mycotoxin is the byproduct that's created by the factory. And so we have to address both of them separately. You can't do one thing that's going to magically get both of them. And so that's kind of the quick overview.
Yeah, so good, because there's a couple of things that I kind of want to bring up about that. But one is that some people are more sensitive to these mycotoxins than others. And I'm going to have Dr. Ingalls back on to talk more about how like the biophysical aspects of how it can impact our bodies. But today we're going to kind of focus more in on like what that looks like in the living environment, because that's your area of expertise. So kind of want to like zoom in on that a little bit more. But the other thing I was going to bring up is like, I got a lot of questions, and this always comes up whenever we talk about mold and I say that bleach is not the answer. Some of that has to do with these mycotoxins, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing with bleach, first off, big picture, I talked about how like the government's not fully behind like the new research and stuff. And you know, the one thing that they do literally write out, the EPA and the CDC both say, don't use bleach to clean mold. Like it's not me, it's not some crazy theory about it. I mean, if you're one of the people that's like, I'm going to follow the guidelines of the big entities, like they're telling you not to do that, right? So that's the first thing. You know, when it comes, again, mycotoxins are this defense mechanism of these molds. So they don't always get produced. I use this analogy, like imagine that you owned a gun and you were sitting in your house holding your gun. You're not supposed to start shooting it for no reason, right? But if somebody busts in your house and they threaten you, you might shoot it, right? I mean, you may not, but you might. And that's kind of what's happening on the mold front, right? Like they have this loaded weapon that they shoot if they feel like they need to, you know? And so when you're coming after them with a toxic chemical that's like basically trying to kill them, that's a threat. And so it can actually induce more mycotoxin production when you're doing that. Another thing that I learned years ago at a medical conference I was at is that if you actually mix mycotoxins and other bleach, excuse me, with like mycotoxins, it can create more potent pesticides that are kind of the combination of those two things. Again, we're mixing chemicals at that point. So there's other things that can happen. Ideally, you're not trying to kill anything. Ideally, we're trying to remove it. And if we think of it that way, then it's not about some magic solution that's going to just poof and it's gone, right? And you're not threatening it at that point if you're doing it a different way.
Right. I do want to talk about removal later on, but before we do that, I kind of want to talk about like, where is mold? How do we find it? Because some of the questions were like, do I need to worry about, okay, so let me ask this way. Is there any type of home or area of the world where we do not need to consider mold? I don't want to say worry. I don't want to induce fear, but it's something that we should be mindful of, right? So like, is there like a brand new build maybe? Is that going to be something that's mold safe? Or maybe I live in the desert? These were the kind of questions that came in.
Yeah, I mean, the truth of it is the mold issues. So one big thing I get is, where do I live? Desert, south, you know, humid versus not humid, this sort of thing. So to touch on that first, most mold problems that happen have nothing to do with where you live. They have to do with what has happened inside of your house, right? So we do inspections in Arizona and Nevada, like all those areas, and there's problems there too, right? It doesn't exist, because the reality is if you had previous water damage in your house, previous things that happened, has nothing to do with the environment outside and the weather. It has to do with, I had a leak under my sink 3 years ago I didn't take care of. I had this that happened. That's when mold grows, right? So that's the first piece, like kind of like geographical location. And when you think of it that way, it's everywhere in the world, right? It's not one particular area. It's not like just the US is dealing with it, nobody else is, right? It's nothing like that. So the reality is mold is it's a thing that has existed for way before we existed. like that's what it is. And so it's going to be around, and it will thrive if we provide an environment to allow it to thrive, right? And a lot of our building practices have kind of created that environment, maybe without us thinking about it at the time. But that gets to your next question, like, new build, old house, new house, condo, townhouse, home, this, that, it's all the same. And the thing is specifically on new builds, so I actually have a good friend of mine who is the owner of All American Restoration, which is the remediation company that we refer our people out to. He was having a new home built in Florida, and he was sending me pictures. Track house, new construction, right? Never been put. All the framing covered in mold. Water leaks coming in from the outside while the build was happening. The testing is showing that there's mold all over the place. Like, these things are happening. And that just shows us, like, the way that our building materials are stored, are prepped, are like they're coming in with problems sometimes, right? And so it's not, and like you said, it's not like a fear-inducing thing, but what it is that we have to understand what we're up against, so then we can have a plan in place to find a spot that's most suitable for us, and that's what it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I feel like sometimes there's a bit of alarm that comes with this information. And I think alarm is okay. I don't like want to tip us over into the place of fear. And for me, mold can be very overwhelming. This is something that I've been learning about for some time, but it feels like this entity that it's like too much for me to grasp, or it's like too large of a concept for me to like try and tackle in a way that is reasonable and is going to like actually benefit my health. So I'm
Sure.
glad that we're having this conversation, because I do think that it's very important and we just need more understanding. So this is good. Let me see. I wanted to ask, okay, so let's say we have, now we know there could be mold. Every home has some level of mold, right? But it's about the type of mold and how much exists within the home or the space. It could be a workspace or school or something like that too. But what we want to know now is like, is our home contributing to health issues? Is it toxic? How do we find out? Like, what are the kind of like signs to look for? Some kind of physical indicators or health indicators that might give us the little red flag that it's something we should look into.
Yeah, so this is the funny thing that I tell people. I'm like, the secret to finding mold in your house is not looking for mold. It's looking for signs of water damage. You can't see most mold, right? If you're seeing it at that point, it's a big deal, right? The stuff is microscopic to start out with. So if we start seeing it, then it's like, oh man, like you think of like the scale of how much bigger it is for our eye to see it versus what it originates as, right? It's kind of like the tip of the iceberg didn't sink the Titanic. It's what was down below that sunk it, right? Like they could navigate it around that. And so the thing is, if you just go around your house looking for mold, you're probably not going to see much of anything. And then you think, I don't have mold. So like, just the big funny thing is like, guys, here's how we do it. You don't actually look for mold at all. Like, you may come across it, but that's not what we're looking for, right? The thing that mold needs to grow, it needs three things. It needs a food source, which our entire house is built out of. It needs the right temperature, which is the temperature that we're comfortable at. So we're not going to be able to alter that. The third thing it needs is water, right? Oh, I got to go higher. Third thing it needs is water. So, scream. That's the thing we can control. And that's the thing that we actually can have an idea of going through and looking at stuff and get a feel for it, right? There are types of water damage. I've kind of broken it down. Whenever we go through a house, there's really only like 5 types of water damage that really exist. And so when we go through a house, we're doing a deep dive, we're looking through everything, but we're looking for like these triggers that there's been historical water damage. And a lot of times there's either 2 ways that it happens. One way is that like we knew something happened. So take like a sink, like, oh, well, sinks leak. That's just part of houses. So it's fine, right? Or this happens all the time, so it's okay. So the first thing I always want to say is like, just because something happens a lot doesn't mean that it's okay. It just means that it happens a lot. And if we know that that causes a problem, then we actually should be more cognizant of that than less, because, and like not normalize it, right? Yeah. And so, you know, areas with plumbing and more water areas, those are areas that we need to be more focused on instead of less focused on. So that's kind of the first thing. And then it's the types of things we look for. And I don't have like images and stuff for you, but there's kind of like 5 categories. So the first one is like bubbling, you know, paint or building materials. So like, if you look like in a sink cabinet, it happens a lot in there. And if you like put your flashlight and you kind of put if your sink cabinet's like this, and you put, instead of shooting down on the cabinet with your flashlight, you shoot this way with the flashlight. The light goes like this, and then it creates shadows from any bumps that are in your cabinet. It's like a little secret trick with flashlights. People are like, is that a special flashlight? I'm like, no, I'm just holding it.
Blew my mind with that. I was just gonna grab my, guys, like, don't point your flashlight at the wall like this, like do it like this, and you can see the water damage. I learned that from you, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going around the house like this.
You can see a lot of the signs just from holding a flashlight like that, right? So like bubbling, which is kind of like almost, it looks like bumps kind of in a wall or a cabinet. Buckling is more like bending. So if things are bent, so that happens in baseboards a lot. Like if you look at a baseboard and you have a wall that's flat and your baseboard's against the wall, but the baseboard's kind of like pulling off a little bit and bowed. Why is it bowed? When water soaks into stuff, it causes it to move and bend. So there's no staining, there's no smell, there's no any of these things you would think about water, but that's like a little clue. It's like, this could be a water thing. And so these are the types of things when we go through a house that we're looking for. And it's a lot of things that maybe most people don't think about, or they've never done like the deep dive on their house to look for stuff like that. But once you know what they look like, and throughout like the webinar and the program that, you know, that we have for people to go through their houses, we show like examples of all that stuff. Then you could go through and really pinpoint like where the hidden sources might be. And we know from all the data that we have that if there's a water damage area like that, then almost 80% of the time, there's actually a mold problem hiding back there. Even if the water damage was like 10 years ago, it doesn't matter. Like the mold doesn't go away, it stays there. And so that's the big secret. If you want to know how to go through your house and look for stuff, go through with a fine-tooth comb and look for weird signs of potential water damage. And that's how you start finding where stuff is hiding.
Right. And these are the things that, because a lot of people think like, well, I had my home inspected when we bought it or whatever, but the typical home inspection is not going to, they don't typically at this time have the kind of understanding that some mold experts have about mold and the damage that it can cause or why it's such a big deal, right?
Yeah, 100%. I can't tell you how many times like I'll be working with a client who just bought their house maybe 6 months ago, 3 months ago. Like they just went in and we go through and find 15 things or whatever that might be a potential problem. And they're like, how is this even possible? We just had a home inspector come through this. We're going to sue them. This is ridiculous, right? Because they're like frustrated, and they should be. You know, there's language in a lot of those contracts that they're not liable for stuff like that. So it's hard. But the way to think about it, I kind of use the correlation to doctors, right? So your general home inspector is like your general practitioner. You go into them, they run the basic tests on you, you know, and they see whatever's going on. And then if something weird comes up that's like outside of their realm, they send you to a specialist. They're like, oh man, there looks like there's something going on in your brain or whatever. We're going to send you to a neurologist. Or man, these are like weird, like cancer potential readings. We're going to send you to an oncologist, like whatever. And in the medical world, it's totally acceptable and cool to do that. Like you should be doing that. And if you don't do that, you probably get sued for malpractice. Like that's the difference on the medical side. On the home inspection side, that isn't a thing. Like, it's like we expect the home inspector to be the expert of every single thing that could possibly happen in a house, right? And it's just not at all humanly possible for someone to be an expert in all those things. They should be referring out. There should be that same type of relationship that exists. But for some reason it doesn't, and it's almost like looked down on a little bit. Like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I need to bring someone else in here. There's like this whole weird, like wild, wild west ego thing that happens in the inspection space too. And it's tough, but that's why things like that get missed. So if you are, you know, mold sensitive, it's so important to not rely on a home inspector, because they still think what the majority of people think, what basically has been kind of the accepted truth for like the last 30, 40 years, which is if there's not water right now, there can't be mold, which is wrong. And that if you see dark, you know, what looks like mold on like framing in an attic, they say, oh, that's just lumber mold. Like, how the hell do you know that's just lumber mold? Like, when did you get microscopes for eyes? Like, it's just so crazy to me that like it happens, and they downplay it, you know? And so those are a couple of the reasons why.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, that's why it makes it so, like, for in my current situation, I'm like, I know that we have stuff that we need to address, but I'm a little overwhelmed by it and the expense that it might entail. And I also don't know how long we're going to stay here. And you can't just like jump into another home and expect it to be safe. Like you need to have it inspected too. So it's like, it's kind of like a whole bag of worms, but it's important to have, just like you're saying, like when I go to the doctor and they're like, oh, this is something with, you know, your nerves, you need to see a neuro, whatever, like you need to have an expert in mold if mold is something that you want to be mindful of or you're concerned about or something that you have a sensitivity to, right?
100%. Just like you would with anything else. Like you would call a plumber to look at the plumbing. You would call
exactly.
Electric.
Yeah. I saw a question come up on here and it was in the questions a lot, but is there a difference between mold and mildew?
No. I mean, short answer is no. Mildew is mold. I mean, it is what it is. Honestly, I don't even know where the term came from. I feel like it was a way to like downplay what it actually is, but mildew's mold. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's like a cute name.
I know, like the way to downplay stuff. Yeah.
Some were asking too. So this is going to kind of we'll see where we go. But so if you smell like a musty smell, or like the clothes that come out of a closet have this musty kind of smell, is that an indicator of mold presence?
It is, but it's not the only indicator. So the thing that I always want to be careful of is that you don't have to have the smell for there to be a mold problem, right? So a lot of people think if there's no smell, there is no mold problem. And that's not true. But if you are noticing like a musty, earthy type of smell, especially like in areas that are closed and then you open them, right? And you kind of notice it come out, or if you just notice it in different areas. Sometimes people notice it when they turn their air conditioning systems on, all of a sudden the odor comes out. Those are all clues. And what that smell is, assuming that that's what it is, most of the time it is, so I can't say every time, but assuming that's what it is, it's what's called an MVOC. It's basically like off-gassing from the mold when it's actively feeding. So think of it like if you're eating and you have gas, basically, like that's what it is, right? But mold doesn't eat all the time. And so if you had, it goes in and out of feeding phases based on moisture. So you could have a mold issue, let's say, in a bathroom that's actually driven by humidity. So it's a mold type that doesn't need a lot of water. It's a mold type that just needs humidity to peak, 60% for it to grow. And so you might notice that like, well, when I use the bathroom and steam it up, then I notice an odor for a little while, but then it goes away, but then it comes back, but then it goes away. This like intermittent odor thing. That's basically like the mold going in and out of like feeding cycle, right? Of when it's breaking down versus when it's not. So it is a big clue. It's not the only clue, but it is a big clue.
Yeah, and it's not something like you mentioned before that we always see, because I know people think like if it's black mold, that's toxic, and if it's not, maybe not, but that's not true either, right?
No, and I just did a post on this yesterday that not all mold is, not all mold is black, or I forget exactly how I worded it, but the idea was that there are molds that grow in all different colors. And a lot of us, when we think again toxic, we always think black mold because that's the mold type that got like the PR agent that started promoting it. Like that's what it was. And the reason is a bunch of kids got sick in the 90s. They found this mold, they tied it together. Now this is the toxic mold, and that's kind of what it was. But there's other species of molds. So that mold is called Stachybotrys. That's what people kind of know as that. But there's species of Aspergillus and Penicillium and a bunch of other molds that have the ability to produce mycotoxins, and they grow in different colors. And so it's not just like black is bad. Like it could be a number of different types of molds.
Yeah. Okay, so we feel like there might be mold in the home, or it might be causing some kind of health implications. How do we find somebody who's mold literate?
Yeah, well, we travel the whole country, so you could find us if you want to. So we're not local. We actually built our entire business with an infrastructure to travel because we were getting inquiries from like everywhere. And so that's how we created it. So we could be an option. The first thing that you could do even before you go that route though, you can do like a kind of a basic home screening test that can give you a feel of like overall mold load in the home. It's called an ERMI. Some people are probably familiar with that. It's ERMI. It's not like the easiest test to read, honestly, and there's some kind of misconceptions in the kind of scoring system of it. But the basics are, it's 36 molds that are species identified. It was a study the EPA did like 15 years ago. And they're trying to create an index where you can compare like your house to other houses. It's not the perfect index, but the cool thing about it is that the technology behind the testing is DNA formatting, and that's like the gold standard for mold testing. So while the like accumulated scores might not be the end all be all of looking at it, if you're doing that test and you're seeing, 20 of the 36 molds, 25 of the 36 molds, so you're seeing like a good chunk of them show up. And then some of the labs that run them, so EnviroBiomics is one of the labs, they actually highlight the molds that are at least 10 times higher what the original EPA kind of baseline was for that particular mold type. So even someone who doesn't really know much about how to interpret it, if you just looked at that report and you say, okay, I've got like 15, 20 of these mold types that are showing up, and 3 or 4 or 8 or 10 of them, or however many of them are highlighted that they're at least 10 times higher, then that alone, like you don't have to be an expert to look at that and be like, okay, there's something that's off here, right? And so you could do that dust collection throughout your house. It's literally a Swiffer pad that they send you, and you just wipe dust from all the surfaces in your house. You don't have to do every room separately. You don't have to do all that because it costs more money to do that. And the truth is, the point of that is really to just get a feel if there's something happening in the house. So I just collect from all the living spaces, just all in one sample, just to see what's there. And if you do that and you see kind of the things we were talking about, then that's kind of the first step for you to say, okay, there's something here that we need to look further into, and then that might warrant doing a deeper inspection and kind of going down a little more down the rabbit hole.
Right. Yeah. And then so we get the inspection, and then inspectors can sometimes help point us to remediators who will do it more appropriately, because not all remediation is the same either, just like inspection, right?
No, and to be honest with you, remediation is super hard to find. That's why we basically only refer to one company, and they travel. So when we came up, we didn't start traveling. We had a LA base and kind of a New York area base, and we had a remediation company in each location that we kind of worked with and really honed in the process of how to do it the right way. And we convinced the East Coast based company to kind of create a traveling component to work with our clients. So they aren't like a traveling company per se, but they will travel for us, essentially, for our clients. So I banged that door hard enough until until they would be open to it, because it was so hard. We create this protocol. This protocol took us years, and it took us a lot of money to figure out what works. And then it gets in the hand of some remediator who thinks they know everything, and they don't want to do it. And then the remediation fails, and the clients are like, well, this didn't work. And then we look at what was done. We're like, well, it didn't work because it wasn't done properly. Like, I can't come and do it, or I can only tell you like how it's done. So it has to be executed. And so you're right. Like, they're not all equal, you know?
No. Yeah, I mean, even looking into it for myself, there's like all these different price points that range, you know, but I personally don't want to spend this low amount and not have it done correctly. And I don't want to pay more than I need to either, but I want it done right, because if we just like cut out part of it and leave a little bit, it's going to grow right back. Or if we cover it up with paint, it doesn't go away. It's still there. It's still going to cause the persistent health problems that I'm experiencing. So it's something that you want to have done accurately. It's like, I feel like it's like taxes. I don't want to pay more than I need to, but I want to pay the amount I'm supposed to, you know? Like,
well, the good thing is, if you pay your accountant more, a lot of times you actually net less, because they got you a bunch more back, right? And so, yeah,
yes.
It's kind of the same idea.
Yes, very similar. Okay, so another question is, if we find out that there is some kind of a mold situation, maybe we did ERM or even did an inspection, but we're unable to do the remediation right away or leave the environment that we're in, are there any things that we can do to help keep us safer?
Yeah, I mean, it's really more of like an individual conversation to figure out like, okay, what are the restrictions? What is the game plan at all, right? If someone really comes to me and they say, listen, I'm not going to do anything, how do I be healthy here? Yeah, I mean, the answer is you can't, right? If there's a bunch of problems there, you're not going to do anything. There's only so much that can happen, right? But if it's more like, listen, we can only phase into this. We only have X amount of dollars. We have to be here for another 6 months, and then we're planning on being somewhere else. Like, if we start thinking about what is the roadmap to get to where we need to get, then we can start having more individualized conversations of kind of like stop gaps and little bridges we can create to try to make it better, knowing that it's not going to be 100%, but at least we're trying to kind of limit load until you can get to whatever the endpoint is, right? And so, you know, one piece of that is air filtration units. They have to be good ones. They can't be these ones from like Walmart and Costco and Amazon. They're going to be a waste of time. They got to be like high-end, you know, medical grade units. They're good as a bridge. They're good as a maintenance piece. They're not the answer to all the problems, right? Mm-hmm. So like if someone's saying, listen, we have to be here for another 6 months, so we're not going to spend a lot, or we don't own or whatever. It's like, okay. So when we think about how we're impacted by this stuff, okay, so you have your factory that's like here, right? And this is what's creating the problems. This is behind a wall. This is in a cabinet. This is whatever, right? This is the factory. Off the factory comes the smoke, right? And the equation, like if you drive by a factory, they're making whatever they're making, smoke comes out of the top, right? The smoke is what we're breathing in air pollution. We're not breathing the factory. We're breathing the smoke that comes out, okay? So if we're trying to think short term, what is our most direct pathway to what's impacting us?
Yeah.
It's what we're actually breathing is the most direct pathway. So what we're breathing is basically the dust reservoirs in the house that get resuspended into our breathing zone just from walking around. That's our direct pathway. Now, yes, the air conditioning may be blowing it more to us. The mold problem in this wall might still be contributing to what's in the space, But ultimately, all that stuff comes together, settles down on surfaces, gets caught up in the dust in the house. That's what gets resuspended into our breathing zone. So if we think of it that way, then if there's not as much dust, then there's less for us to breathe, right? So one thing that you can do is be super, super diligent on dust management in the house and feel like you're doing spring cleaning on steroids every week. And if you're doing that, then you're not going to get rid of all of it, but you're at least reducing the load of the accumulation that will keep getting built up into your zone, right? So let's say you do that and put in like a really stringent cleaning plan. And then on top of that, you maybe add in a couple of those filters that come in, right? So what we're doing effectively is, if you think of like your room being filled, like there's a fire in my room and it's filling my room with smoke, and I'm not concerned about the fire for some reason. I just don't want to breathe the smoke, right? So the option is, I'm not putting the fire out. I just have to pull the smoke out of the room. All right, so how can I do that? Well, I could open the windows. I could maybe push a fan that moves it a different direction and gets it out of the room. Is there still going to be smoke left in the room a little bit? Yeah, because there's a fire right here that's causing it. But can we maybe pull out half of the smoke that I'm breathing in this room? Maybe. And so those are the types of things that you can do as like little bridges to get to where you need to be. If you test your heating air conditioning system and it's really bad, then you don't run it, right? So at least you're not pushing it. So there's little things you can do. At the end of the day, though, if you're still being exposed, you're still being exposed, right? But if you have a plan in place and you know kind of where you're going, then there's things you can try to do to minimize that.
Yeah, and this is important too for even after remediation, because you want to prevent it from returning. So that's obviously going to be like controlling any water damage coming in, but also the cleaning, the minimizing dust, and then mold again is not killing it. You're trying to remove it. So that's using cleaning products that aren't contributing to the toxic load of the home, but are doing an effective job at removing the mold. So to keep it at bay, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the cleaning products, to be honest with you, like, I know everybody gets caught up on like, what do I use to clean mold? Mm-hmm. Like, the truth is, you shouldn't be cleaning mold. You should be removing it. That's the truth, right? So then when you think of it that way, it's not like there's some special magic product you should be using. You know what I mean? I wouldn't want to be using things that are super toxic, because it's just adding the toxic load like you talked about, right? So you can use more natural things. Thing is, if you see mold growing on a wall, right? Wiping the surface of the wall and cleaning the wall is not getting rid of it. And I think that's like the big thing. And so it's more about managing water, understanding like the things you could do in your house to keep an eye on it. Like, so one quick example, every month at minimum, pull everything out of your sink cabinets. Every single sink cabinet you have, pull everything out at least once a month, if not more often, because that's one of the places where there's a lot of water, leaks happen all the time. And when you have stuff in your sink cabinets, you can't see down there because it's all covered up. So when you pull it out, all of a sudden you're like, oh man, there's a weird little drip stain here, or there's a weird little bubble here, or something like that. And you can get ahead of it before it turns into a big problem. That's more important than me giving somebody some magic cleaning product to go wipe all their walls and stuff down with. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Because there are some products that seem like they could have some impact. I'm not going to name names, but it's more, they're a tool, but they're not like the most important thing that you can use, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
But they can be a tool. Let me see. There were a lot of bathroom questions. That's like where we see the physical signs of mold the most, but it doesn't mean like it's the only place that has mold, or just because you see it, that's the only mold that's there. But I did want to bring bathrooms because I have a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, and it happens a lot in bathrooms. And again, it's one of those things, there's a lot of water sources in a bathroom. So of course there's going to be more potential for things there, and like frequency. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. And then there were some questions about like having, some people are worried about having to throw out all of their belongings when they find out that they've been living in a moldy environment. Can you touch on that a bit?
Yeah. So there's kind of like general rule of thumbs. It's kind of specific to testing. So the first thing is, part of the reason we test is we tested the different areas of the house. So we're trying to figure source. So we tested source. Then we're trying to figure out, are the ventilation systems impacted, because they will continue to spread. And if we do all the other remediation in the whole house and the HVAC is contaminated, it's just going to push it out. So we test HVAC separately to figure out, can we clean it instead of remove? And then, and then the third thing that we test, and this is kind of more where it comes in the content thing, is just the surfaces throughout the house. So exactly kind of what I talked about with ERMI, right? Go through the house. You do dust collection throughout living spaces of the house. We test for mold, which is ERMI. We do mycotoxin, which is the chemical byproduct. Remember, again, they're not the same thing. One is a chemical that's not alive. The other one is an organism that creates chemicals, two different things. And then we test on the other side, we test for bacteria and bacteria toxins. That's usually the umbrella of what we test for water damage stuff. If you do that throughout a living space of a house, you're going to see what's settling on surfaces because you're collecting dust from surfaces, right? So now you make the connection, okay, well, this is settling on my things, right? So then we look at what's there. Are there toxins there? If there's toxins there, you're going to want to be more aggressive in what you're getting rid of, probably, right? If there's not, then maybe you can clean things a little more easily. So what I do is I have this matrix that I made for my first training course I did like 3 years ago that I call like the content salvation matrix. And it was kind of like this, right? And on one side was what your items were made out of. So you have solid items, semi-porous items. Semi-porous is like wood, for example. Solid is like metal, glass, ceramic, something like that. And you have like wood is semi-porous. And then on the bottom is porous. This is like cushions and mattresses and things like that, right? And then on this side of the scale, you have how much does that thing cost? Is it cheap? Is it expensive? Is it sentimental value that is no, you know, there's no price for it, right? Like that type of thing. And you kind of put it on a scale like this, and then you start plotting it out, right? This is something that's semi-porous, that's super cheap. Well, if it's something that's super cheap, that's semi-porous, and you can replace it really easily, replace it if you can, right? If it's something that's semi-porous, but it's expensive, those things can be cleaned, right? So then you say, okay, so maybe I'll attempt to clean that. So that's kind of how to think about it, but the general rule on like what can't be cleaned, basically, anything that's cushioned and porous, you can't clean because cushions are thick, right? And so what's happening is not that there's mold growing on all of your stuff. Like if there is, you get rid of it. That's a whole nother thing. If there's mold growing all over it, you get rid of it. Most of what's happening is cross-contamination, meaning that the particles floating around, all that stuff is settling on your things and it's just kind of like wedging into it, right? And so that's why you would clean it. In a cushion that's thick, every time you sit down, every time you lay down on the mattress, you're opening the pores of that cushion, all the particle wedges in there. There's literally no way to get in and clean it out. But then every time you sit down again, you're popping up all that particle back up into your initial space, right? Because that's what happens when you sit down like that. Right. So those are the things that you can't really clean. So what I would do is I would look through the test results and I would be like, all right, if there's any toxin load in here, you're just throwing that stuff out, right? Because you're never going to be able to fully clean it. If the mold load and the bacteria load is really low, it's up to you, right? It's not a thing. I don't know. We didn't test it individually, but if the load is really low throughout the house, maybe it's okay. If we're finding a high load, even if there's no toxins, you know those particles are floating around, you know they're getting into the cushions, and you know there's no way to actually clean them. Like the most you could do is like vacuum the top of it and try to wipe it, but you can't get into the cushion. And so then I would say, well, those are the types of things that you would consider wanting to throw.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. And then, so if we are like, if you're, so this will apply like if you're in a moldy environment and you are trying to move into a place that's less moldy, or you're just moving in general, what can we do to ensure the next place that we go into is not mold toxic?
So the first thing you could do the same screening tests in the house. That could be your first starting point. A lot of people, now renting's different, your timelines aren't as long when you're renting, but if you're buying, you don't have to know the answer right away. You have a contingency period. So you can look through a house. One thing is that really learning how to look for the signs of water damage, it's big. It's understanding that. It's not something I can teach in like a thing like this, right? Because you just have to see it and you have to have it explained. That's why we kind of created the programs we have to really like map it out for you. But that's the first thing. If you could go through a house and know where to look and know what to look for in terms of what water damage looks like, then you could walk into a potential purchase or rental and walk through that place and say, listen, I don't even feel like I'm an expert, and I found 10 areas that look like a potential problem. And then you just walk away and you don't have to worry about testing or anything, right? Because you know that behind 8 out of every 10 of those places, there's going to be a hidden problem. And so the thing is that you can, like, people can do this. You don't need to.
I can't hear you.
Social media blocker came on. The thing is that, like, you don't need to fly me out to do that. Like, literally anyone can look at that stuff. It's not a magic tool. It's not some, use a flashlight the right way and look for something, right? Anyone can do it. And if you do that, you could take that and go through as many houses and places as you want until you find a place that doesn't have a lot. Like when my wife and I were looking, we're renting our place now. Whenever we look to rent a place, we kind of have this whole like dance figured out where my wife distracts the realtor or the showing agent, and I wander off to a different room and I kind of look around like, oh, this place is so cool. And then I wander into this room and I pull my little flashlight that's this big out of my pocket and I scan the whole room in literally less than 3 minutes. I go through the whole thing and I walk out, and in my head, because you know I'm just keeping in my head, I'm like, okay, there's something here, maybe there's nothing here. When we went through this house, I found one thing in the whole house. It's a 12-year-old house. I was shocked. Before we came here, I was like, Nikki, you understand that this house is 12 years old. There's going to be problems here, right? Just because there was one problem that I saw going through the whole house. I was like, okay, let's get it. You're not going to find anything better than that, and we can figure it out once we get in here. And so that's the first step. Like if you really want that, then learning how to look for that stuff and taking that onus on yourself, you can do that and you could bypass so many problems. Then after you do that, let's say you're going to buy then, right? You go through the house, they're showing you the house, you have your husband or your wife distract the person and you're going through looking at stuff like I am. And then you're like, okay, there's only like 3 or 4 things in this house. This seems relatively manageable. Because guys, you're never going to find a house with nothing. So like, just be really clear about that. The goal is to find a place where there's a few things. It doesn't look like it's a massive systemic full house, you know, massive problem. It's, oh, there's been a leak under the sink. There's been a leak over here, kind of like isolated stuff. And know that if you find 3, 4, 5, 6 of those things, it's not the end of the world. And once you get to that point, you say, okay, let's put an offer in on this place. So you do that. Then the next thing you come in and do is you do ERMI testing, mycotoxin testing, maybe the bacteria testing. That's something that's important, you know, for whoever's going through. You do that in the living space of the house. You do it in the heating, air conditioning systems. Those are 2 places you do it. Those results come back. If the HVAC is screwed, you're like, all right, I'm in at least 20, 25 grand to replace this entire HVAC system. Okay. Am I going to do that? Well, if I could get them to credit me for it, maybe, but if I can't, then I'm going to walk, right? Or you do it through the house and you say, man, the ERMI looks super bad and there's mycotoxins in the house. Then why even mess with it? Just walk away. You're in your contingent period. You can leave for any reason that you want to. You can just walk in and say, oh, you know what? I didn't see that plant out front. That flower's super ugly. I'm out of here. And you can just walk. And so you use your period. You just have to kind of figure out like how you time it all out. And before you put in the offer, you do, when you're looking through the house, you do the initial water damage screen. And then if it doesn't look too bad, then you kind of go to those next steps.
Yeah. I feel like it's a little bit like buying a car where you kind of like, you want to look at all the details inside before you buy it. And even then, if you're like, I don't know about this, I'm going to have a mechanic look at it before I invest in this. It's similar to that, where you can look through, and I saw somebody asking like what kind of flashlight. I have to keep harping on this because it's amazing. It's any flashlight. That you hold it at. It's incredible. I'm just like, let me show you a wall. Like instead of going like this, you go like this. You see so much more that way. But yeah, Brian has all kinds of tips like this too. So I'm gonna wrap it up here, but you can find out more on his Instagram page, which is Mold Finders. I'm going to save this. I'm going to link that. Also check out his podcast, Mold Finders Radio. And there are so many different topics covered in there, and covers all of the things that we touched on and more in depth with tools and resources and all of this too. And is there anything else I should point them to? I can link in stories too after this.
Yeah, the webinar that you saw was, so that's Mold Finders Method. So it's a webinar I do right now. I'm doing it twice a week. I think I might start doing it weekly if I can. It's a basic like one-on-one teaching of everything from like the whole process, right? So if you want to learn like, how do I find hidden mold in my house? What are the things I look for? What are like, I go through kind of the overview of all of that stuff for free. I do it, you know, right now every 2 weeks, maybe every week. So that's Mold Finders Method. You can literally register. That's a webinar that I do consistently. And then, I mean, if you do want to talk to us about maybe looking through your place specifically, if you want to kind of have, you know, us dive in, my company is called We Inspect. It's yesweinspect.com, and we can talk about, you know, setting up an inspection or something like that. But that's the deal.
Yeah, when I finally get to doing it all here, I will take everyone with me through the process. Not quite there yet.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd love to be able to help you throughout everything too. So, yeah, I appreciate you taking time to chat with me today. Yeah, I feel like there was so much more. So,
and we could talk about this forever, but yeah, I want to keep it so, like, you know, brief enough, but there's so many other resources out there. So I do want to direct you guys to those other places, and I will try my best to save this on my page right now. But thank you so much, Brian, for spending the time with us. And I feel like, you know, I feel like information can be empowering or overwhelming, and the way that you present this information always makes me feel more relaxed about this and more equipped and empowered to tackle it in a reasonable and approachable way that makes sense for me. You know, it's do what you can with what you're able as it makes sense for you, and you really help us to do that. So thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for taking the time to watch.